Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some questions for the proponent of the bill.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, how many vaccines are currently on the schedule with DPH for a child in school to be immunized? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
It's a great question. I'm going to do the best of my recollection. Understanding that some of these shots are actually second or third shots or boosters, I believe the total number required, I believe the minimum required is 26 if given individually, but typically in order to catch up, one would probably only need 18 shots to be in compliance. I think that's correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Thank you for that answer. Can you speak to the frequency of how often a vaccine is added to the schedule? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a good question. Frequency would suggest some sort of regularity in that occurring. As you might imagine, there's a lot of research going into potentially creating vaccines for dangerous diseases and even for less dangerous diseases and conditions. So it really reflects the nature of advances of science as opposed to any specific periodicity. At a point in time, there were probably quite a number that came through in a period of time. I imagine now we may be on the cusp of a whole new era based upon some of this new RNA research where we might be able to come up with vaccines for all sorts of things. But that's purely speculative on my part. There is no specific frequency. There is no particular time in which we can count on a new vaccine being available. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Can you speak to in, let's say, the last 5 years, how many new vaccines have been added to the schedule? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of any specific vaccine in the past 5 years, but I am not an expert on this. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Okay, I think, can we agree since the time I've been in school, since the time you've been in school, there have been more vaccines added to the schedule? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely we can agree, which means that there are a bunch of ways now that we can protect people. Science is really good. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the chairman please explain to me the process in order to add a vaccine to the schedule and to be required that our children be immunized with that particular vaccine, what the process is to add it to the schedule? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a great question. There are several phases to this, to be absolutely specific. There is the approval of a new vaccine, which takes place at the federal level through the CDC. It has to go through rigorous trials of various natures to prove both safety and effectiveness. At that juncture, the CDC may choose to require or recommend that vaccine, and we're talking about in this case for children, and that they issue such a report. It is still up to the Department of Public Health, if it's only recommended, to decide whether or not it wants to add a vaccine to Connecticut's schedule. And I should add that we also have the regs review process that if DPH should choose to add a vaccine, the legislature would also have an opportunity to review that decision before it was added. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Again, thank you for that answer. That leads right into my next question. Could you please explain to the legislature and to me what the current role of the legislature is in either approving or not approving a new required vaccine?
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would describe our role at this juncture is deciding whether or not we think DPH has a good reason to add a vaccine. We have not been in the business of adding vaccines into statute for some time. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
If a vaccine was to be added from this point, assuming the underlying bill, if a new vaccine was to be added to the schedule, under current law, does it require a full vote of the legislature in order to approve that requirement? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my knowledge, no, it does not. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
So then what is currently required, what is the legislature's role specifically to either approve or disapprove that request? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, the one clear role with regard to new potential vaccines being added to the schedule is the regs review process. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Can you tell me currently how many members of the legislature is on the regulations review committee or process?
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know that number, but I bet it would be pretty easy to look it up. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Okay, we will definitely do that. Would you say that? Would you venture to say it'd be less than 25? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I would venture it would be less than 25. I think there are relatively few communities that have numbers that high. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Okay, obviously there's 151 members of the House of Representatives and 36 senators that currently make up this legislature. Through you, Mr. Speaker. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the good representative asking me as to the number of representatives and senators? At last count, even assuming vacancies, there are 151 state reps and 36 senators. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Lanoue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you speak to the role of the representatives and the senators, that 187 people, those of us who are not on the Regulations Review Committee, what role do we have in either saying yes or no to adding a new vaccine to the schedule? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say, in general, we do not have a direct role. But as we are obviously doing today, we're debating legislation. I suppose it is possible we could choose, as a legislature, to add a specific vaccine to the schedule. I do know that many people believe that's not a great idea for the legislature to be directly involved with that and to render it as a political decision as opposed to a medical one and trusting the professionals to make that determination. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Thank you for the answer, Mr. Chairman. Under current law, as we stand here today, if a vaccine is added, a particular vaccine will be added to the required schedule of vaccines, and a parent has deeply held religious convictions that they object to by injecting a child with that particular vaccine, they can take the religious exemption, correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you. If the good representative is referring to existing law, yes, indeed. If an individual has a religious exemption, that religious exemption applies to the entire vaccination schedule, whatever it might be at that point in time. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
Okay. Now, if the underlying bill before us passes and the religious exemption is essentially stripped or removed from the parents, and they have, in the future, there's a particular vaccine that they have deeply held religious objections to, and they approach me or other members of the legislature, most whom are not members of the committee process of the Regulations Review Committee, and they're seeking for us to, and they have that objection. What would we tell them? What would we advise them? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, if we're to presume that this bill passes with grandfathering, all the children currently in school would be able to still avail themselves of their religious exemption. If we're talking about new cohorts of students coming in, the religious exemption would not be available to them. If they were to appeal to members of the legislature that they have a religious exemption, that would not be the law of the state of Connecticut, and I don't know what the legislators would be able to do on their behalf. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
I guess where I'm going with this, thank you for that answer. What check or oversight would we then have if the religious exemption is removed, and currently not all of the legislature is involved in saying yes or no to any new potential vaccine? Where's that check on adding the that particular new vaccine to the schedule.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, there are two aspects. One, there is the regs review process. So if a legislator has concerns as expressed by a constituent, I would advise they certainly talk to all the members of the regs review community before they render an opinion. And secondly, even though it's unusual, and I probably wouldn't recommend it, the legislature always has the prerogative to pass law with regard to things of that nature, and could conceivably, even if not a great idea, choose to pass a statute that would put limitations or create permissibility for a particular vaccine. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lanoue.
I want to thank the chairman for his answers. However, I think we need to have a greater check to ensure that the entire legislature is involved in any new proposal, any new vaccine that is being added to the schedule. We need to be able to have that consent process as an entire legislature. So with that, Mr. Speaker, the House Clerk has an amendment in their position. It is LCO 6981. Would you please ask the clerk to call it, and I'd be allowed to summarize.
Would the clerk please call LCO number 6981? Sorry, House Amendment B.
House Amendment Schedule B, LCO number 6981, offered by Representative Dauphine and Senator Summers.
Representative Lanoue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this amendment does is exactly that. It requires any new scheduled vaccine that would be added to the schedule receives approval from the General Assembly. And I ask for its passage, and I also ask for a roll call vote.
So would you